I first of all want to thank the adjudicators in IMRO for their judgment in all three cases. I'd like to thank my wife Emer, who's with me, and Emer deserves her own Lifetime Achievement Award for putting up, I suppose, with me and with my interest in radio and broadcasting all the time we've been together. I once described Emer as a De Valera widow, as in golf widow. The occasion was that I was on an American radio program, which was I was advancing the interest of selling my book on De Valera in the United States at the time, and I realized just very quickly that the interviewer A hadn't read the book, but B thought that De Valera he thought Sean McBride was De Valera, basically. So I just decided I'd go for it. So I said, I'm married to a De Valera widow because this is the scale of the research I've been. So I was really sort of selling the book and selling myself and making sure that he appreciated the amount of research I'd done for the book. And that's how I so described her. But I'd like to also welcome here today Betty Purcell, whom I first met. She applied on an interview for a job with Current Affairs in RTE, and she did terribly well. She didn't get the job, and I didn't know then that I would spend so much of my time working with her on Day by Day, first of all on radio, and later on Questions and Answers. One of the persons who did get the job actually was Mary McAleese as Current Affairs broadcaster. Robert Canning is also here, formerly of RTE Sound Archives and now an independent production archivist, and a wonderful colleague and an encyclopedic knowledge of archives, and always been a great help to me. I'd like to also thank my first employer in the GPO. That's how far I go back. That was Francis McManus, who was an extraordinary leader of the features department at the time. And he used to say, I went to the United States at one point, and I know now, looking back sometimes at the archives, how he must have realized that I was a worker, because I went to America and I interviewed, and these were walk-in interviews. Jesse Owens, Jack Dempsey, Joe Lewis, Eartha Kitt, John Glenn, the astronaut. So in those years, the only person who ever said no to me on these terms was Bob Dylan, who, and I understand this completely, and you people would certainly understand it, and that was that there was no arrangement made about a fee or copyright or all of that stuff. I hadn't really done any work on that, so he said no, he couldn't do an interview without his agent, etc., etc. But they were very innocent days, if you like. I'd like to mention Dermot Brannock, the man who professionalized the RTE archives. And as a schoolboy, I used to be a great listener to Radio Ireland. I remember Brian Boydell as a broadcaster and Norris Davidson explaining the intricacies of the opera. He had all sorts of explanations of the opera. I was too young and innocent to know what he was talking about. All about infidelity and murder and jealousy and so on. And this was all above my head, but I enjoyed the music. Now, I also want to mention one thing about public service broadcasting, because it's now sort of a cornerstone of what we do, and it's talked about. But it was only when I was researching, and people have asked me also if I would have been interested in doing a companion volume to a book I wrote 10 years ago, Window and Mirror, which is the history of kind of RTE television. And it was when I was doing that book that I really learned a lot about radio. And what I was learning about radio was that radio broadcasters rather had managed to embed public service broadcasting in RTE, but they did that not on radio, they did it through television. Because it is really the story of RTE is the story of the 1960s and 70s. All the attention at that early part was on television, which is that was the cutting edge. That's where the politicians were suddenly aware that broadcast journalism had arrived, because it hadn't arrived in radio. In fact, I was asked by Robordo Farraguin, who was the head of radio in Radio Ireland at the time, if on the 50th anniversary of 2RM, if I would prepare a talk on current affairs on radio before the television age. I was pretty well placed to do that because I was working in both television and radio. And I said yes, but what he didn't know was that what I'd really said yes to was I could see the subtitle, Current Affairs on Radio Before the Television Age, the golden age of silent radio. There was really no serious current affairs on radio. Nothing on in the morning. The station didn't come on in the morning, didn't reach its peak hours. People have forgotten all that now. But so the history of radio is really there, embedded sometimes in the. Sometimes you can see it through the prism of looking at current affairs on television. Now, I mentioned about a possible sort of book on radio to mark the 2RN, and the best achievement of Irish radio, really, I would say, over its whole life, has been traditional music. They captured the music, they saved the music, they were there in time to really people like Kieran McMahon and what have you. They did an enormous job, and it was also determined by technology, by what was available at the time. Broadcasting, the mobile recording unit arrived, that changed everything, but tape was what really changed everything. Because in the old days, traditional musicians would be brought up to the GPO for a Sunday afternoon concert, whatever. And by the time they got there, it was 10 days later, they had enough time to have stage fright, to be in their Sunday best, and the performance was not what it could have been when Kieran McMahon arrived with a tape which could run for hours. And they were almost being recorded before they knew it. There's one other thing I want to mention about that, and that is that something I was working on yesterday was a program was a new book on Tommy Potts, which is being produced and brought out tomorrow, launched tomorrow, and I'm doing my program about that on Sunday. But the extraordinary thing about Potts is that he was so innovative, he was so much himself, and in a way not flamboyant, or wouldn't bring himself to the attention of the public very much. So he's almost a secret recluse as a player. And at one stage, and this is the cornerstone of what I want to really say about this, is that he arrived for the program with an interview with Peter Brown. Peter Brown was 24 at the time, and Seamus Ennis was being recorded in Peter's house out in Sandycove, his parents' house. And Peter got the idea of, couldn't we add Tommy Potts to this? And they said yes. And Peter got a bus into town, another bus out to Walkinstown, knocked on the door. Tommy Potts didn't have a phone. Asked him would he do it, and he said under no circumstances would he do it. Made some tea for Peter, served some fish. Peter said, I must go now, back to Sandycove. Tommy Potts put on his coat. He said, let's go. He took his fiddle, and that's where the origin of this session comes from. And no taxis, Public Accounts Committee, please note. And this is the other point, is that Potts was an amateur. He was a plumber for 4 years. He was a fireman for another 20. And then he was a rent collector. So he was an amateur musician. And he is absolutely astounding. And so he's left, the book has now been written by his grand nephew, Sean Potts. But the point I'm making is that it's in the archives that all of this oral history is captured. And people like Peter Brown and Kieran McMahon and many others, and Aoife McCormack now, they deserve so much attention, and they deserve so much credit for that. I want to finally mention one final person whom I owe something to, and that is Lone O'Brien, who was Secretary of Post and Telegraphs. He was a listener on day one to 2RN, 1926, with the cat's whiskers, trying to get a sound. 35 years later, he was a senior person in the Department of Post and Telegraphs, and he was not there on the opening night of television. I can still hear him saying it to me. The world and his wife were there. I wasn't. I wasn't invited. And the reason he wasn't invited was that he had done so much to alienate the people when he was standing up for, alienate people like Edward Roth, the first Director General, when he was standing up for what would become public service broadcasting. and he had to take Sean Lemass by the lapels and instruct him. It's in Window and Mirror. It's instruct him on the importance of what broadcasting would be. And I think he's the person. If there's a posthumous Hall of Fame, I would say that Lon O'Brien is one of the people who's at the cornerstone of what public service broadcasting was. And he's also the only man who stood up to John Charles McQuaid, by the way. O'Brien was a serious Catholic, a serious churchman. And he's in all the people who McQuaid had dealings with, he was the only person who had stood up to McQuaid. Most people didn't do that. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.